After sinking 20 hours into Ghostwire Tokyo and with no end in sight, I'm glad I waited for the Xbox Game Pass release. It's a confusing mix of compelling and mundane that leaves me briefly entertained for short bursts and coming back in the hope that it'll improve. The problem is every time I stop and think about the overall experience, I'm disappointed by the squandered potential and annoyed by the lack of respect for my time. No, I'm not someone with enough free time to sink dozens of hours into truly bad games, so I'll start by highlighting a few things Ghostwire Tokyo does well, to better explain why I'm so disappointed. The first, and perhaps most significant positive, is Tango Gameworks' version of Tokyo after a supernatural disaster. It's an eerie, audiovisual treat and feels authentically Japanese to the point I'd strongly suggest you go with the default voice work and subtitles. The English voice work was just bland and unexpressive in comparison. The Shibuya City Ward, a literal ghost town with most of its denizens spirited away right out of their clothes, is a dense juxtaposition of old and new. Modern shopping districts, transport hubs and apartment buildings jostle for space alongside old temples, parks and low-income tenements. Modern grid-like roads and elevated highways crisscross a much older layout of claustrophobic alleyways and footpaths. Of course, I can't comment on the accuracy, but it's a dense, detailed environment that incorporates many iconic landmarks. It takes a few hours to get a feel for the scope, and you'll soon spot reused assets and layouts, but it's still damn impressive how variable it feels, despite being set in a single city ward. If you can look past these supernatural action-adventure trappings, it's an unexpectedly immersive experience, thanks more to the believably proportioned architecture than the stunning visuals, thick atmosphere, and haunting soundscape. The second element I love is the striking character designs and personalities of the protagonists, villains, lingering spirits, and diverse roster of visitors. They're not the awkward hybrids of Eastern and Western stereotypes that developers like Capcom and Konami are so fond of. The main story and side quests also draw on a mix of ancient Japanese folklore and modern urban legends to creep you out, while the innumerable collectibles slowly expand a massive database, full of interesting information on that country's history and its ongoing influence on modern cultural practices. As someone whose first experience was with an NES and playing arcade cabinets primarily manufactured in Japan, it remains a country and culture I've always been curious about. If you share that interest, Ghostwire Tokyo is at least easy to recommend for those that enjoy some digital tourism and concise bullet point tourist guides. Featuring a map that expands with story progress, the problem is you can't see all of Ghostwire Tokyo's environment without engaging with the slow-to-evolve gameplay loop that relies on repetitive busywork to get the most out of it. As an action game, combat is a core part of the experience, but despite a supernatural twist that incorporates Kujikiri hand gesture attacks, purification rituals, and enchanted talismans, Ghostwire Tokyo plays like a frenetic modern FPS that rewards mobility, prioritizing targets, and the use of tactical powers and finishes. You deal with a reasonably varied roster of visitors by stripping away their physical shells with elemental attacks, think wind, fire, and water, each emulating a common weapon archetype, before shattering their cores to banish them. An enchanted bow can pull off distant headshots, talismans are used like grenades or traps, and aggressive stealth can thin the ranks. To keep you on your toes, faster and tougher variants are progressively introduced. Projectile-flinging enemies fill the screen with deadly spheres. Flying enemies can come at you from any angle. Some can cloak, and the bosses typically possess multiple abilities all rolled into one. In theory, and in the trailers, it looks great, and new abilities and upgrades have been added with the Spider's Thread update. However, combat is only ever as fun as the tools you have at hand. Without grinding for upgrades, basic elemental attacks and abilities you unlock from the story missions feel pitifully weak, and result in sluggish, tedious battles with limited tactical depth. It highlights one of my common counterpoints to those that argue this sort of busywork design is purely optional, when it's clearly tied to gameplay depth and the enjoyment factor. If your combat is at its best when players can grapple and glide between rooftops, pick off distant stragglers, smash down into mobs at street level, tear out the cores of stunned foes, and then dispatch the rest with a flurry of elemental attacks, you need to demonstrate that flexibility and intensity early on, not have the player grind levels and skill points for a dozen hours first. That brings me to my next criticism of Ghostwire Tokyo, but this applies to most open-world games. If you have limitations on the complexity of your storytelling, the depth of your gameplay, or the quality of your presentation, surely you would design the experience to mitigate the impact. You see, as big, beautiful, and diverse as the environments may be, it didn't take long to realize every activity, outside of some early and late-game story missions, are repetitive and often disconnected tasks, many of which demonstrate open-world designs I thought we had moved on from a generation ago. Far too many times I descended into a subway station, discovered a secreted away temple, or climbed to the roof of a massive, intricately designed building, only to find nothing there to justify the effort of designing such an intricate location. What little environmental storytelling there is just piles of discarded clothes and short, often repeating notes. A few times I thought I found such a spot, only to return later when it was suddenly populated for a mission. Side missions sometimes fare better when they use discrete locations, but as intriguing as the premise might be, they are underdeveloped and utterly unconnected with one another. Both of these designs are dated and immersion-breaking, and it makes the game world feel incredibly artificial. Of course, what you will find everywhere are clusters of, and I shit you not, 240,000 lost souls that you can absorb and set free for experience towards leveling and skill points for the granular skill tree. You'll also earn abundant maker currency, which you'll want to spend on Katashiro charms at Nekomata cat yokai stalls to increase the number of spirit you can hold, if only to make the grind moderately more efficient. Before long, the map becomes a barely navigable mess of icons, and when you're not collecting souls, some of which require a match-the-pattern cleansing ritual first, presumably to annoy you further, you'll be collecting relics, praying to statues, giving dogs treats, reading the thoughts of cats, absorbing yokai for their magatama to unlock higher skill tiers, lining up and purging cursed photos, and collecting capsule toys. Hell, just stocking up on elemental ammunition requires constantly punching spectral junk littered all over the environment. Now, it's not that I don't understand that checklist style, one more short task compulsion, but playing Ghostwire Tokyo is often a combination of distracting and tiring. It's difficult to go more than a block without a dozen distractions, and many of the mid-game story missions fall prey to bland design. Most of them revolve around cleansing Torii gates to clear a path through the deadly fog, with story-heavy, unique locations and scripted sequences left for the final 2 chapters, and a few standout side missions. As a result, the wonderful environments and creative visitor design soon become background noise as you engage, albeit just barely, with innumerable trivial tasks that litter your path. Whenever you stop and consider the overarching narrative, you'll realize just how thinly stretched and how inconsequential many story beats are. Even as your combat options inevitably expand, battles grow repetitive as so few feel handcrafted or thoughtfully placed. The longer you play, the more the average gameplay experience shifts towards monotony, and it should come as no surprise that the achievement and trophy lists are dominated by collect X% of this or collect all of that tasks. Now, I'm not a developer and might not appreciate how long it takes to craft content, but I struggle to understand why Tango Gameworks, and indeed many large developers pushing for open-world games, would bloat the game to the point it's tiresome, less engaging, and features poor gameplay and narrative pacing. Is it truly preferable to develop a long and boring game that forces games to play for hours, rather than a brisk and exciting one that people would complete and potentially replay? A quick look at the achievement and trophy collection percentages for PC and PlayStation 5 reveal less than 25% of players have seen the story to completion a year after release, while completion rates for the most tedious collect 100% tasks range between 3 to 5%. I guess you give them points for an upgradable spectral vision mode you can spam incessantly to highlight nearby items of interest to speed things up. But given the modern release schedule, who has that much time to sink into one game's tedious collectathon? I think what confuses me most is Tango Gameworks woefully underappreciated The Evil Within 2 demonstrates they can craft open-world style environments that provide a balance between handcrafted and emergent encounters and offer fleshed-out interconnected mini-story arcs. They could have stuck to the same approach and used the deadly fog mechanic to channel you to smaller but diverse environments, with more handcrafted encounters and substantial side missions for padding. A shorter, tighter game with quicker progression also felt far less mundane, while still highlighting the quality of their world-building, characterization, and the narrative. It leaves me wondering where the game director was late in production, asking questions like, why is 80% of our content busy work? Or, if our main story and side quests already offer 20 to 30 hours of gameplay, is this filler even necessary? And, are the time and money we've spent creating filler content actually adding or detracting from the overall experience? Ultimately, Ghostwire Tokyo had the potential to look, sound, play, and feel unique, but a solid foundation is buried under a mountain of monotonous busywork, using a template we've seen 1,000 times before. If you've got this far, please consider giving the video a like and maybe subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow.